What I'd like to do is hand over to our last speaker. So David is he's a vice president at Verve Industrial. His pedigree maybe goes back over a quarter of a century to when he created his first control system, and maybe one of the highlights was protecting the systems at the Olympics at London 2012, which at the time was the most attacked system on the planet. And as you may have noticed, the lights stayed on, and that was thanks in no small part to David. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much. So hopefully you can see my screen, as we are all saying these days. And the picture there, that's probably the best I will look. And thank you, Andrew. I think the thing in the pre-conference when we were getting together now is I can say this with confidence. Simon and I are now feeling slightly old when we start talking about the number of years that we've been involved in cybersecurity and OT. For me, it's more than a quarter of a century ago since I designed my first control system, and more than 15 years of protecting everything from nation states, including the UK grid and the DNOs around it for the Olympic Games. And as you quite rightly said, the lights stayed on. We were very fearful at the time that the lights would go off just as we thought James Bond, but his stunt double was bailing out of the helicopter, and that there would be the sound of machine gun fire over the speakers and all sorts of things would break out. Thankfully they didn't, but it was the most attacked system in the world at the time. And actually, when you look back at it, not a lot has changed, because 15 years ago, I was preaching defense in depth. And I was talking about my network intrusion devices, although we made those ourselves based on snort rules and custom signatures and deep packet inspection. I had host intrusion detectors, pieces of software that we put on various control system boxes, and 15 years ago, manufacturers said you couldn't do that, but I've been doing that for more than 15 years. We were putting firewall rules and policies in place. We were doing all of that against a structure and a standard, which at the time was NERC-CIP. NERC-CIP was the one that we were all trying to demonstrate some compliance to. So we've moved forward 15 years, but actually a lot has remained the same. And when I talk about what's remained the same and what's different, well, industry today seems to think that ransomware is the largest threat vector. It's their #1 concern. And I think as evidence, you look at lots of surveys and they'll talk about 54%, 51%, or at least half of us, all of it had seen some sort of impact. Nation state, well, we do live in interesting times. I think that's another quote. And yes, that's definitely more prevalent today. But the good old-fashioned stuff that I used to deal with, like devices being added to networks because some technician somewhere is doing some maintenance work, the conjoined integration of IT and OT, confuses me there, because I think that's been prevalent for about 15 years or more. We saw Eric talking about supply chain and the good old-fashioned accidents. So we're all concerned about what can happen in our world. Simon talked about standards and the mapping, and so when I look at the Middle East, yes, there's more of a prevalence, standards popping up. Andrew quite rightly talked about 62443 seeming to be the standard of choice. And one of the things that I would always point out is we see they all map. Quite honestly, I think if you're putting together, we did the 20 critical controls. My friend and I did the 20 critical controls for what was the UK Critical National Infrastructure, CP&I, however many years ago. Actually, it's all good practice, and it's all about putting a good program in place. So we can definitely help you look at that mapping, because they do. They're all, I think, essentially based on what is good practice, what should we be doing. I'm going to talk about 62443 and some of the terminology, and of course, how do you distill all of that stuff down into 15 or 20 minutes? It's a bit of a task, but I'll try. And I'm always happy to talk about this stuff offline afterwards, or in our session later. Alphabet soup. I never realized that soup could also be a theme for a conference, but alphabet soup, there are lots of 3- and 4-letter acronyms. So let me start by trying to get some of the acronyms under control. We talk about zones and conduits. So what are they? And there's some slides in a minute to explain them a bit more. But zones really is just groups of cyber assets. It's just groups of stuff like Windows interfaces, your HMIs. Conduits, how do you talk to those devices? What traffic flows down? What networks to get to those boxes? SLs. Actually, I always find SLs really confusing, because am I talking about SILs? Am I talking about service levels, or am I talking about security levels? And when we get into that in more detail, you know, we've got actuals, we've got target, and we've got capabilities. I think that bit's quite straightforward. But when you start to get somebody talking about SL1 to 4, I start thinking about Purdue models, and it's not. But it is quite simplistic to look at the model there. It's just more complexity for us to get around. Foundational requirements, that's something I really do want to talk about in a bit more detail. I'm covering that later in the slide. There are 7 bits there that we can talk about. And then security requirements. Many security requirements are required for each foundational requirement. So for me, this is like the layers of the onion. The bit I will put out now is, if you're ever going to try and attempt to do all of this stuff as a manual process, build your own platforms, build your own things, it's an awful lot of work. So whilst I might make a pitch for using us as Verve to help you there, really that's something where you've got to be looking at platforms, you've got to be looking at partnerships for an enduring effort. You heard Eric talking about how 62443 is evolving. I think that's a good thing. It's evolving. It's going to include SBOMs. I think we're all looking forward to that. It will include a lot of other things. But the positive here is it's a whole life cycle approach. If you're going to enter a life cycle approach, you really need to be thinking about platforms. You really need to be thinking about how do you install that and implement that as an enduring process to keep forevermore. Zones and conduits. So let's start there. It's groups of cyber assets, boxes, typically Windows boxes, could be other things there, that are naturally grouped together with common security levels. Often you structure them by functions, so you could have things like your boilers and your SIMs, and it includes specific endpoints and software and hardware and operations. It's groups of cyber assets grouped together in some logical reason. The conduits, like I said, is effectively how do you communicate with those, and you start looking at protocols. Your mod buses, your other things, what enables you to do command and control assets and data. And really what you're trying to do here is find what are appropriate security structures, policies, things that you will look at for those conduits. SLWAT. So I already said this bit confuses me sometimes because there's lots of acronyms, service levels, security levels, SIL levels, all sorts of things. But typically there's only 3 tranches here. You talk about targets, you talk about capability, you talk about what did you actually achieve. So the target level really is what is your desired security level by an organization, conceptually, all the rest, that you want to achieve. And it's perfectly acceptable to have different values for that target security level. What do you want to achieve? How are you going to measure that for each zone, conduit, or even facility? What's reasonable for you to go and achieve? Capability gets interesting. So this here, when we start talking about capability, this is, well, where could you really get to based on sets of controls, good controls, design, configuration, combinations of all the above. What capability could you really get to? And then the achieved bit is the grim reality of actually, where are you? And that's when you start looking at residual risks, what's left after you put compensating controls in place. I talk about compensating controls because it's not practical in many instances to overcome a vulnerability because of patching. So you have to look at what else can you apply to mitigate your risk. Really, the bottom line on my slide here is you have to use assessments to define what is right for you for each one of those security levels for a zone and conduit. Beneath here, you'll talk about 1 to 4. What do I mean by 1 to 4? Well, number 1 is where somebody does a casual, coincidental type of impact on your system. 2, intentional violation, but that's simple, low effort means. 3, we're starting to get interesting here because that's intentional. Somebody's coming after you. Moderate sophistication. And 4, that's a nation state. That's really somebody is gunning after you, and that's probably the hardest of all to impact and defeat. Let's spend a little bit of time here on the foundational requirements. You really have, and I like the fact that it's presented as a circle here, because I think in my experience we'll always go round and around this forevermore. The first and the biggest one is manage the authorized users and accounts and their access to the system. Typically, when I do my first surveys of a system, depending on the age and size of, I might find 20, 50, 100 dormant accounts. That's people who've had access to the system over years. Often they've had default admin access, and nobody thought to take, or there wasn't the process in place to take all of those accesses away. And then that's a really big task, easy fruit to go chase after. And by definition, as people change, their roles change, you're going to be continually updating that. You need to have a system, a process, and a tool. The next one, we start talking about enforce the assigned privileges of an authenticated user. So now we're starting to talk about how do you restrict access to what's appropriate, and that will always be changing. System integrity, protecting yourself from malware, vulnerabilities, insecure code. That's where, to me, that's where things like SBOMs definitely coming in. How can you ensure that if you don't actually know what asset, what software, what firmware you have on your system? So you need to have a way of finding that out. The confidentiality of the information, as Simon and Andrew already pointed out, that's important, but probably not the most important thing for us. It's all about availability. Restricted data flow, let's start talking about protecting endpoints from insecure ports, services, and other communications paths. So that really is this piece about how do we harden and continue to harden the infrastructure that we put in place. Monitoring endpoints for security events, that's looking at logs and behaviors and communications and responding quickly. Endpoints is a really important part here. I think the journey of most people, and I used to work in that space, is looking at tools that are looking at network monitoring to see what's happening on your network as being an indication of state of health and events. But even 12, 15 years ago, we understood there that actually the largest threat vector is all of those Windows-based boxes or Linux-based boxes that were data repositories, that were HMIs, that were engineering workstations. Actually, that's your biggest threat vector, and you have to monitor them, and you have to put some form of endpoint software there so you manage all of your endpoints. I think also you need to have all of that linked to some kind of solution, platform or other that enables you to respond quickly. It's no point having alarms that come on your SIEM and then waiting days for somebody to go and investigate them. There needs to be the whole workflow for what is an event and how do you go triage that effectively. Backups, resource availability. How do you ensure the availability of your control system? Well, actually, you can do backups. You can do incremental backups. You can do diffs. You can use your diffs to look at, has there been an insertion of malware? I'm just dealing with an organization that admitted to a $55 million impact on their security breach with ransomware. And one of the things that they failed to do was do backups. So that meant that they were offline for months. And this is just an organization in the packaging industry, which has resulted in layoffs and which is resulting in a company sale. Imagine if you'd have looked at how do you do backups. And we can talk about how can you appropriately use IT tools in the OT world with lots and lots of configuration changes to help you there, and also use the engineering tools that the vendors give you so that you can ensure you've got good backup policy for all of the devices on your network. It's amazing how many people just don't do that. So the foundational requirements actually really are pretty foundational. Let's look for, you know, a Windows HMI SLT. I suppose that I could ask the question here is pop quiz. Who remembers what the SLT meant? T? No answers on the pop quiz there. So let's talk about targets and let's talk about 1 and 2. So this is about just casual events. This is not about nation states. What should you be doing? Well, you should be looking at you know, group policies at the top. Actually, group policies around the whole place here. You should be looking at USBs. Who allows USB ports to be open, not filled in with araldite or cement or disabled? A lot of people just don't. You should be looking at patching. You should look at system hardening. Antivirus is an interesting one. Yes, you can run AV on a relatively modern box. Yes, there's lots of caveats around that. What becomes interesting is everybody's got a mixture of control systems on their estate. If you've got a mixture of control systems on your estate, that also means that unless you've done something different, even at just simple AV, you're running a whole number of different AV software packages depending on the boxes. And how do you manage all of that? You need to have a structure and a program around it, because most people it falls by the wayside. You can look at confidentiality with whitelisting. You can look at encrypted protocols. That is becoming more of a thing these days. Encrypted backups. Are your firewalls on? Have you got Windows Firewall operating? Have you got any policies for permitted traffic? All of those things you should be doing. SEM alerts, remediation, monitoring and performance. So even for just something like a Windows HMI box, there's a lot of things here which are good, standard, common practice that people should be performing. And actually, you can see that that's a fair old maintenance burden unless you find a way to automate that process. So what does a 62443 program look like? Actually, it really looks like any other kind of structured process. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze in a minute. Identify, assess, design, implement, maintain. You know, easy to talk about. First bit, identify all of your endpoints and start talking about zones and conduits, not purview levels, but zones and conduits, and start thinking about risk criteria for all of them. Determine what your target security levels are based on looking at the overall risk of the enterprise. Pick something that's appropriate. I'll talk about that in a minute. Look at all the current status. Actually might not be as good as we'd like to think it is, and look at potential impacts. What would that mean to you? Design gets interesting based on all that stuff and technology assessment. Let's start prioritizing the go-to tasks for your foundational requirements and your security requirements and start looking at compensating controls. Compensating controls can be as easy as firewall policies, can be as simple as permissible traffic between different points. Simple stuff that we can implement fairly quickly. And then you get to your roadmap for execution. Organizational requirements and responsibilities becomes interesting, because once you commit to this type of process, you have to commit to it for life. It's not something that we can say we'll do 1 or 2 years of. You're committing yourself to this, and the enhancement of a 62443 program over 10 years, maybe, until the next best thing comes out. You should think of it as a 5 or 10 year commitment. The implementation bit gets interesting. We start talking about hardening and configuration, and Simon was talking about all of those good things. And we start, the most important bit here is about training and developing the organization. That also requires commitment for you. And the maintenance bit, you're going to have to maintain, manage, look at all these things in real time for a long period. And that's really where you start to look at automation and audit and compliance. So the stepping stones here, we start talking about looking at risk by zone and conduit, look at your specific target service security levels, iteration. This is going to be an iteration going from where we are today to where we want to be, probably stopping along the way at where's acceptable for you, for the business, and the risk that people are willing to accept for the level of effort that we're going to need to put in, until we get at something that says arrive at an SLA that is greater than or equal to the SLT. That's about getting to the minimum acceptable level of resilience. And that's all about putting specific controls and a platform in place. I keep coming back to the platform. This is so hard to try and deliver and maintain if you're trying to do it manually with a patchwork quilt of stuff. You really need to be thinking about platform. If I was going to look at reality bites, what stops people today, what makes them go, that's hard? Asset visibility. So many of us have gone down the route of let's have a look at passive and let's look at the devices on the network. And the guilty secret is you'll only see really 60 to 80% of the devices on the network. So you won't see everything, and you won't get the granularity that you want, including what is the software on those boxes. We talk about the SBOMs, but even just knowing what applications are running on any given box, impossible to do with that type of visibility. How do you get across a complete cyber assessment for all of your sites? That's unfortunately probably a limited time engagement and a lot of effort. We talked about SLTs, etc., but I think it really is that managing of all of the requirements across multiple dozens, hundreds of sites. I mean, I've got customers with over 600 sites, and imagining how they might try and build a program that they can manage, which they do from a single location. That's very hard. It's very hard as well with the amount of security talent within an organization. It's interesting that there's not that much is being spoken about in this event about the limited number of people there, and I think that's going to be a challenge for a number of years. There's definitely challenges between IT and OT as to who owns what boxages. We're an OT company here. It's about damage limitation, do no harm. An interesting one here today is about hardware. Anybody had trouble trying to get boxes today? I can tell you from personal experience, just getting those boxes has been frustrating over the last few months. I think that will change, but it's quite hard to deploy projects today. And I think, this is an interesting one. Where do you get today after going through Purdue models for the last 5-10 years? There's a lot of fatigue around how do we manage and maintain all of those boxes. Budget, that's an interesting one. If I'm going to leave you with some things here, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I wish I'd picked a more resounding one to pick than Andrew did, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good. That would be the thing that I would want people to take away from here. This is a work in progress. Let's set some really good practical objectives and work our way to there, because no matter what we deliver in the instance, it's going to be better than you have, and we'll get to a much better place. Rather than reading the slide, I think, what do I want here? I think mitigating controls, that's practical. Network and endpoint, you're going to have to do endpoint. I know everybody will talk about vendors, but quite honestly, I've been doing that for 10, 15 years. There are easy ways to get through that piece about putting sensors onto hardware platforms, OT-based platforms from the control system vendors. I think you just have to embrace that and move on, and focus on the greatest, most obvious threats first. So don't let perfect be the enemy of good. You're going to be doing this for a few years. Let's start with some practical things that will move us forward. I think I've already covered this, but it's a really nice graphic. We've all been looking at, can we use the network in intrusion type sensors, passive technology, to see what's going on in your network. Actually, we look at this as being like the sonar, the fishing. Where are all those fish? Where are all those things that we should be looking at? Honestly, if you're going to go to 62443 or any of the other standards that are spinning around there, you're going to have to knuckle down and put sensors on. We've been doing it for years. Lots of people have been doing it for years. You're going to have to look at what is on those OT boxes. Otherwise, you just don't get that information. We've had Eric talked about installed software and firmware and SBOMs. That's here today. We have to do that. And by doing that, we have to also talk to all of those boxes. Platforms will help you do that. Where are your biggest risks? Actually, your biggest risks are probably from all of those IT-based boxes in the OT world. And you need to know about accounts. You need to know about who's got dormant accounts. You'll never get that with any other type of information solution. The 360 view, yeah, actually, endpoints will enable you to do all of that. You can look at your hardware and software inventory. That ties very nicely in with SBOMs. Look at published vulnerabilities. Look at what patches have been applied, what hasn't. Start looking at insecure configurations, user accounts and access risks, anti-malware network, backup recovery. Really, you have to look at the whole for this standard or others. And if you implement a platform, you could look at something which will automate all of those processes for you. Otherwise, you're really going to tie yourself up with an awful lot of manual effort. These are the things you're going to have to do and automate and do consistently and audit and provide the trail breadcrumbs to say that you've done all of these things to a level that's acceptable by the business. If you don't, rot will set in. What you'll find, backup failures, not running, nobody noticed. I can't tell you how often I see that today. Changes were made to the configuration, nobody knows. Somebody goes out to the field to replace a card in a backplane, and they put an insecure or an old configuration in it. Nobody knows. There's a vulnerability. Things don't work. You have to keep on top of all of these things. If you don't, rot will set in, and you'll go back to at least the place you were before you started the project. It's a very messy slide, but actually the point I want to make here, the world moves on. Lots of things will pop up on your estate. You'll see changes made to firewall configurations. You'll see unapproved configuration changes made to control systems, to interfaces. Backups won't get made. I keep mentioning backups, they're really important. Unidentified, unapproved wireless devices suddenly turn up in a backplane. Yes, I can speak from practical experience, seen that. I've seen people do the thing of plugging Wi-Fi enabled printers into networks, seen all of those things. you're managing something that is in continuous state of flux and change. If you don't put tools and processes and platforms in place from us or anybody else, how are you going to manage all of this change over time? It's going to be really hard. And here's my final bits, and Andrew will be very pleased. I'm trying to keep us to time. You really need to put an OT security management platform in place. Something that does all of this. The key bit is actually knowing at any given time what is your current asset inventory, down to the cards on a backplane of a PLC in a substation somewhere. That's sort of what the task now is. My finishing point, I think IEC 62443, it gives us a good framework to build all this on. It's about enduring, it's about sustaining. It can be daunting, budgetarily and resource intensive without technology. Anybody's trying to put together a manual program around this is going to find it incredibly challenging. It's incredibly challenging on a personal basis. It's going to be really challenging in a resource basis. I think there's a good tech-enabled path. You know, given more time, I'll talk in more depth about that. Happy to talk to any of you about that afterwards. I've talked to everybody about crawl, walk, run, and it's not meant to be offensive in any state at all. But you are where you are with crawl. Walk, let's get you to that practical place, and run when we've got all of these tools or a tool set in place and you're automating everything. This will become fine. It will be easy for you to achieve and maintain. And at that point, I am done. Thank you.